Welcome to this month's Launch Awesome AMA. I'm Steve. I run the Launch Awesome community, and today I'm joined by Andy Yeo. I think I'm getting that right. I
Yep.
didn't know I'm supposed to ask before, but here we go. Anyway, so Andy, man, what's to say about Andy? He built out the product team at Airbyte, led kind of like integrations, a little bit of like DevRel kind of stuff at Segment. Currently doing some advising, some product coaching, and a bit of angel investing. So if you're raising, make sure you obviously hit him up afterwards. See if he's interested in investing. So today, me and Andy are going to be talking about his experience getting continuous discovery going during his time at Airbyte. And we can you can speckle some questions in, or we'll take them at the end. We'll see how many we can kind of work in there. If it's your first time joining us, these AMAs are put on by Launch Awesome, which is a Slack community for product folks. So PMs, PMMs, product ops people. We talk about the strategies, tactics, pro tips that folks use to build and launch great products, and also build great product teams as well. We got over 600 of the best in product and product marketing from companies like Webflow, Hopin, Loom, Twilio, Dovetail, and more. So if you want to join, just Google Launch Awesome. It's kind of the first hit up there. You'll find an application to join. And if you want to submit some questions, like I said, go ahead and drop them in chat. We'll work them in, and we'll get to it. Alrighty, Andy, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Excited
of course.
for today's conversation.
Yes, totally. Okay, so for the folks that don't know, I like to start out each AMA like this, but give us the quick 2-minute highlight reel of your career, just so people kind of know where you're coming from.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I haven't spoken much, but so probably hard to detect, but I'm Australian. I have an education in marketing, but spent really the first half of my career traversing the go-to-market side in various pre-sales and post-sales roles across Asia Pacific at companies like LinkedIn and Hootsuite. So that was incredibly fun because I was on the landing teams, I was building up offices from scratch, and I really appreciated that version of a startup kind of experience. And so in my last role in the region, I was the only solutions engineer or sales engineer supporting the entire sales team. So I became the product liaison, working very closely with headquarters, with product and engineering for the first time, to surface the region's biggest customer pain points. That's when I realized I wanted to be even closer to that part of business and thought about transitioning into product. So I'm a bit of a wanderlust. So was ready to move to a different part of the world. And so I came to San Francisco, which is where I'm based today. And I've held product roles, as Steve mentioned, at both Segment and Airbyte, both within the data space. So at Segment, I was focused on the extensibility tooling that would enable our partners to help us build integrations and so grow that catalog. At Airbyte, I held a bigger role because I was a founding PM. So I built out the team there, the processes for product, as well as leading our strategy for scaling our catalog of connectors or integrations. And so in today's conversation, I'll be focused more on sort of the experiences at Airbyte. So just to give folks a little bit of context, if you haven't heard of us before, Airbyte is a data movement platform. So what that means is every company has data that they have to move from point A to point B. Usually that's into like a database or a data warehouse for further analysis. And most companies require quite a bit of manpower from their data engineering teams to build individual data pipelines for these sources of data. So with Airbyte, instead of doing that, you can add a couple of clicks, be able to connect to multiple sources of data, and move that into your downstream databases or data warehouses.
Cool. Love that you got your start kind of on the more on almost like the go-to-market side of the house. I feel like having an experience. So in previous lifetime, I was a co-founder of statuspage.io. And as a co-founder, you do a little bit of, everyone does a little bit of everything. Having that experience of being able to see all parts of the business and how they work, I feel like really makes you such a better product manager. It gives you having both of those, like all of those perspectives, being able to hold all those perspectives at the same time. I feel like gives you, I don't know, this better sense of ownership of like the whole company. I know a lot of PMs can kind of get, I don't know, almost shoehorned into like, oh, I just think about this one part of, what I'm in charge of. But having had those experiences, it like opens up your mind to how the whole thing works together. So love that. Okay, off on a tangent. Okay, today we are talking about your experience kind of implementing continuous discovery at Airbyte. Can you kind of, before we get into that, set the stage of the company a little bit? Like how big is? Talk to me about the product team. Like how big is it? How's the team structured? Let's just start there.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to touch very quickly on this tangent that you went on, I actually think it's very relevant. I think especially in this community of folks. I'm a big advocate of folks coming from different backgrounds, and I think where it's relevant to this conversation is folks who come from different backgrounds, especially customer facing backgrounds, tend to have a lot of empathy. And so I think that that level of empathy lends itself very well to thinking about how do we understand our customers and our users better. So
Mhm.
yeah, bring that back into today's conversation. So
Cool.
setting the stage, like I said, this was during my time at Airbyte. At the point where this sort of became a topic of conversation, we were about 4.5 product managers. And the reason I say half is because at Airbyte at that time, we had a growth PM who wasn't formally part of the product organization. She
Mhm.
was on the growth and go to market side, but was sort of like semi involved.
Mhm.
With the 4 PMs that were formerly part of the product org, they were split between two parts of the business. So one was our connectors organization, which is what I led and was responsible for figuring out how to actually always have the integration or the connector that a customer needed in their data stack. And then the second part of the business was the platform organization. And so they were more focused on like the reliability and the overarching experience of the holistic product outside of connectors.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. So you guys are cruising along. Something's happened. Things aren't working as well anymore. You feel like, hey, we should make some change. We need to be maybe more thoughtful about our kind of approach talking to customers. Talk to me about like what was going on that you felt like, hey, we need to kind of rethink how we're doing this.
Yeah. And so actually at this point, it might be helpful to set some context even around the size of Airbyte. So
Yeah.
Airbyte at this
Yeah.
point, I think we were probably around like 50 to 60 people. 7 or 8 months prior to that, I joined as number 18. And since then, the company grew to like 110. And so, like, very much in hyper growth. Uh,
Hmm.
and so,
Hmm.
what I share today may be more specific to like early stage organizations and specifically where the pain point arose. And I distinctly recall talking to my CEO about this was like, we were very quickly starting to lose touch with the day to day of what our users were doing and what our customers were doing. At this
Hmm.
stage of company, everyone's running around like headless chickens and trying to figure out like what is this initiative that we're doing? How do we sort of focus on all of that kind of stuff? And you didn't really have, or we had sort of overlooked one of the um, key responsibilities of the PM role and the value behind what PMs can bring to an organization, which is that voice of the customer. We
Hmm.
did talk to customers, but it was very much on like a one-off for certain initiatives, and I think that's the direction that we're trying to, as an industry, move away from is time in
Hmm.
place or user research that we're only talking to someone because we're about to like ideate and like release a particular product. And so that's sort of the point at which we were like, hey, let's take a step back. We as PMs need to be much closer to the customer or to the user.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds kind of like it's not a good idea to just decide, hey, I'm gonna run a half marathon and just do it. You need this muscle like kind of already built. If that kind of makes sense. Um, okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so tell me about like next steps. You guys, last time we chatted, you mentioned okay, first step for us was like we got together, we did book club, we read continuous discovery habits. Talk to me through talk to me through that, how you guys kind of felt about the book, how you I don't know, how you kind of organized around that.
Yeah. So I think after that conversation was when I sort of really doubled down and was like, hey, this is something that I should dig into. I mean, honestly, like Teresa Torres is very reputable. Her book was very reputable at the time. I just never gotten
Mhm,
around to reading it. And so
mhm.
it was a great idea actually to sort of stand that up as the first book in a book club that we established for the product team. And so we
Mhm,
would read 1 to maybe 3 chapters every week. The purpose of
mhm.
this was really to, with any sort of like change management, anything you're trying to introduce, is making sure that everyone's bought in. I think like everyone on the call, if you've been a PM for a while, like I think stakeholder buy-in or any buy-in is critical. And so reading the book really helped the team get a sense of like, okay, what was the problem that we're trying to solve for? What is the shift, as I described earlier, around moving away from the time in place kind of research to like a continuous process? Why was that important and why would that be helpful for us? And so that was how we approached it. So it took a bit of time, but like we got through a large majority of the book. I would say that, and this is where folks on the call might experience this in their own organizations, our instinctive
Mhm,
reaction was, this is really great in theory. I don't know
mm.
that we have the time or that it's necessarily relevant for us right now. Um,
Okay.
and that was a really
Yeah, tell me
interesting
more.
conversation. We would like read the chapters and we'd be like, okay, like we just want the answers. Like we're talking about like all this kind of stuff, but like how do we actually implement? Um, and I think for a
Mhm,
while as a team, we were kind of stuck and we were ready to just be like, oh, whatever, like we're just gonna go back to what we've already been doing. But I think if you treat
mm,
sort of this framework and this process almost as you would a product, like for us, we sort of thought about it as like, okay, like what's the MVP? What's the lowest sort of barrier to entry that we can implement? And from
mm,
my perspective, as I sort of thought about the group, was like, if I'm seeing folks already drop off away from the idea right now, like we're never going to be able to implement this. Like it doesn't matter what stage or like how mature you get, like it's only going to get harder. And
mhm.
so that's where I think like shifting gears to thinking about implementation, like one of the key things that was top of mind for me was, how do we make sure that this is the easiest thing possible, that doesn't sort of make a PM feel like, wow, like I've just been told to do like so much more work.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, talk to me. Did you feel like there was kind of a lot of pushback around that, a little pushback around that?
It was a little pushback. I think, I mean, something I'm grateful for is that at Airbyte and sort of at most early stage companies, you hire for people who are really willing to roll up their sleeves and really willing to be scrappy and do what it takes to make something happen.
Mhm,
I know a lot of folks have come and asked me the question of like, hey, like, PMs already have so much work on their plate. Like, how is it possible that this was something that you could add onto the plate? And
mhm,
honestly, there was pushback, right? But I think having read the book as a group, we were very
mhm,
aligned on the value that it would bring. And sort of it
mhm.
was front loading some of the work that we knew inevitably we would have to tackle. And this
Totally.
would give us a better upfront and like, not to repeat the word of continuous, it was kind of like, if you think about it as like working out or like preparing, let's use this like marathon thing again. um like if you're preparing for a marathon and you're only waiting to till the weeks before the marathon to really train, it's going to be that much harder. And for us
Mhm.
it was very much like, hey, let's start this, do it once a week or do it twice a week, let's sort of see how things work, and then we can iterate, pull back, add more as things come.
Totally. Do you feel like the hesitance was more, from other people within the product org, or did anyone else kind of like on the periphery, the exec team, was the exec team worried that it's a waste of time? Was the dev and design team worried like, oh, we're already not getting enough support from product, like they shouldn't take more on? Or is it mostly kind of like from other PMs?
Not really. I would say that most other teams, to them, when you talk about the idea of like, hey, PMs, whatever, whether it's continuous or otherwise, if you present an idea to an external function and it says, hey, PMs are going to have a better pulse on customer and user sort of pain points. Like we didn't get any pushback. There was never really a line that those individuals or those stakeholders necessarily drew and said, hey, like if a PM were to do X, this means they have less time for us. That was sort of an expectation on the product team to figure it out, and to
Yeah.
sort of reprioritize their time as needed.
Right. Okay. Yep. Totally makes sense. Okay. So yeah, talk to me about step one. Presumably, the first bit is like, hey, we need a system around recruiting users for more interviews. Like, talk to me how you guys thought about kind of systematizing that.
Yeah. So I think coming into that, there were two main sort of like principles that really guided us in terms of how we implemented this. So the first was, as I mentioned earlier, a low barrier to entry for us as a product team. I wanted to make sure that like the adoption of this process and this program made sense, and it, where possible, was as easy as possible. The second was on the user side or on the like customer side. How do we make sure that this was not disruptive at all, but it was something that was welcoming and enticing enough for people to sort of get involved with? And so that's where like I'll give a plug here to what we used was Calendly. I'm sure there are other services out there that will support this, but a big reason why, I mean, we were already using Calendly internally. We were already using it for various external calls. The feature and functionality that Calendly enabled was really, really helpful. And so actually initially we thought about, hey, like each PM will have their own Calendly link. And then we'd sort of figure out, depending on the topic of conversation that a user would be interested in sharing, we would then share the respective links. And that was just like way too complicated. And so we moved sort of that decision criteria sort of up, or sort of, I guess, like further down this journey. So with Calendly, what we used was a round robin link. And so like we had everyone's calendars plugged in and we just had a single link. The specific thing that we wanted to make sure to do though was to have a required field within that form that allowed the interviewee to actually share like the topics of conversation that they were interested in talking about. Whether or not that linked to a particular PM's product area was not something we necessarily focused on early on, but it was just in preparation if we needed to like loop someone else in because the topic was like a bit too deep. At least we would have that information up front.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Like to get like into the weeds of this. I think people actually kind of like the like specific how you did it. So you're saying like individual Calendly links for like topics of interest assigned to certain PMs was like overkill and made it too. You guys weren't feeling it, so you guys went to. So you're saying you went to like a more round robin system where people would kind of maybe have times and they'd randomly get like assigned ones. Is that more or less how that works?
Yeah. And I would say like specifically driving it back to one of the principles I shared, which was like we wanted to make sure that it was low barrier to entry for PMs, but also low barrier to entry for users. The idea of having individual links for every single PM. I mean, we were a small team, but like as you scale, like that would change anyway. It's like who on the like internal Airbyte side would be managing who to send which links to? Who like on the user side, like what was their sort of experience? Like they would have to maybe submit an information about what they wanted to talk about and then wait for the link, and what would that look like? And so like from that perspective, it was just a subpar experience.
Right.
There's obviously some downsides with the round robin. Like you're going to have situations where perhaps like on the connector side, we were getting a lot of interviews on like platform related topics. But one thing that I've held pretty I have a pretty strongly held opinion here, at least at an early stage company, even when it comes to like feedback and insights, is I would like the product team to actually have a pretty holistic view of like what is happening. So even if your product area is like fairly specific, at this early stage, there's not really too much of a need for you to silo yourself. And so there was definitely like benefit in having people take calls cross-functionally, right? Like across different parts of the
Mhm.
business. And
Yeah.
I have a pretty big belief that that actually helps you be a better PM because you get the context from different parts of the product surface area.
Yeah. Kind of dovetails with what we were talking about earlier about just having a more holistic view of the product, of the business, of how people are feeling. I feel like makes you just in general a better PM. Okay, that's really interesting. One other thing that you said was around not making it easy for PMs and not disruptive for customers, and also not just that, but also enticing to customers. Any thoughts you have around there around like how do you I mean, you're kind of pitching customers, you're selling them on something a little bit, right? They're gonna have to spend some of their time and energy to come do it. What kinds of things did you do to make this easy for customers to sign up? How did you make it seem appealing so that people signed up at all? Yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of elements to that. I think like one of them is the channels that you choose to distribute this information, or this
Mhm,
ability to sign up. The second is the copy and sort of the ask that you're making. Um, and so let me start with maybe the channels. For us, I think like once we sort of solidified that there would just be one link and all of the scheduling, everything was done like after that link. That link
mhm,
just became the thing that we could choose to share. And so it was a combination of things like anything that was an external facing customer communication. So some examples that we tested out were things like churn surveys or like
mhm,
MPS surveys. Or
mhm,
at Airbyte, we were a open source first organization, so we had a lot of like a fairly large community, and so we sent like
mhm,
newsletters, and we also had a big Slack community that sort of was pretty like open in terms of like how we could send stuff. There's also like some automations when folks first sign up to a Slack community. There's a way for like we would have links there for like if you have feedback, please sort of like click on this link and schedule time. I would say that so those channels. Oh, and in addition to that, like obviously in-app things, right? Like you can do in-app pop-ups depending on what services you use within the app. I think for us, where we were using either Customer IO or like Chameleon. Um,
mhm,
so the channels matter a lot in terms of like where are you and where is the user and what is their mindset of like what challenges that they're facing. The second thing is more around copy. And so I think one like very specific example here is we definitely tried it with the churn survey. We didn't get a lot of response. And the reason
mhm,
for that was, I think, twofold. One is like when someone churns, it's very unlikely that they have any additional motivation to give you the time of day. And so what we adjusted there was like, hey, like it's actually okay. We probably won't get very much in terms of like a proper conversation. So like the
mhm,
copy we switched up to say, hey, like just reply to this email with a few bullet points of like what you had challenges around. But
mhm,
if you're interested, feel free to schedule time with us. We lowered our expectations there in terms of like whether they would want to talk to us. Conversely, with things that were happening in app, like if we were able to, when we adjusted sort of the timing of when something popped up, or like, I think some
mhm,
folks have asked me this before, is like, how do you target the right type of user? Like, especially in app, you have a pretty strong control over that, right? Like, okay, if they've done like conditionally these actions or like they've run into this error, like when is this going to pop up? That really helps you narrow down like almost like a qualified participant in that like they've suddenly felt some pain, and
mhm,
normally they could just, I mean, more than likely they can talk to support, which is great. You still have an avenue of like channeling that information to you. But if they're interested, they, especially like at least in our world at Airbyte, we had a lot of people who were, I guess, like very devoted to like testing things out and sharing things. And so from that standpoint, it was like more about, oh, hey, now there's an avenue available for me to talk to product. Um, And then like rounding out the copy piece, it was like a lot of it came down to how you framed it. I know, Steve, you just mentioned like as you talked about like enticing, it was like what is the incentive, and like you're asking something
Mhm,
of these individuals. I think the
mhm,
framing of that you can actually change in that like
mm,
half the time it's not that we're asking anything of our users. We're there to help our users. We're there to help our customers and give them an opportunity to be a part of the build process, to be a part of the growth of
mhm,
the product. And that
totally,
is actually like incentive enough for a lot of folks in that they're like,
totally.
like normally this is such a black box, or like, I mean, any company that you're at, you're kind of like, I mean, I wish I
Yes.
could talk to a Jira PM about the UX design. Not
Yeah.
bringing that up from any Slack conversations that have happened recently. Um, but the fact that you're sort of extending that invitation usually is pretty strong incentive. We did also like in parallel test with certain things around like Amazon gift cards and stuff like that, and that can also
Yeah.
help. It just sort of depends on internally what your budgets are, like how you want to choose that. Ideally, personally, I felt like reserving that for like larger actual user research things is more helpful, but um,
Mm,
you could also do things with like credits within the application that you're working on. Like, what are those types of
yeah.
incentives as well?
Yeah. Love that. That's cool. Cool. Okay. Okay. So we're signing people up. Okay. So going into these calls, I don't know, what kind of like prep were you doing beforehand? Or did you have a list of kind of specific research questions you were trying to answer for every call? Or how did you approach those?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is no. We didn't have anything prepped. We didn't have any specific questions. The only rule of thumb that we held um, is the rule of thumb for any sort of like user conversation and research, which was to ask open-ended questions. Uh,
Hmm.
Really, the purpose of this, and I think one thing that I want to maybe at this point draw some distinction around is, at least for us, continuous discovery was not intended to be scoped to any particular topic. It wasn't intended to validate or invalidate any specific hypothesis. So in that sense, it was different from like your standalone customer research initiatives that folks do. Um,
Hmm.
and in that vein, we didn't have specific questions. The goal was to give the floor to the user and the customer for them to share anything they wanted to
Yeah.
the product. And so
Yeah.
the question, I guess, was really just like, hey, like, thanks for joining. Would love to hear what you wanted to share with us. And then from there, you're
Hmm.
just asking more questions. They might be sharing a pain point. Sometimes I think like one of the pitfalls of this is like they might want you to debug something live with them. And generally speaking, like you politely decline and you sort of like commit to like supporting them later on, and
Hmm.
you can follow up, but you want to spend that time actually learning about like, okay, like how are you doing this, like what are the can you like walk me through this experience that you're having and like talk me through the challenges. So it's pretty like standard stuff, but the most important thing to think about is like keep your questions open, but also um making sure that the user or the customer feels like the floor is theirs to talk about. It's a safe space for them to talk about anything they want.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Just kind of like the big wide open question about their experience. Great place to start. And then, yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think in my experience, just asking people like, "Oh, show me how you do X in the product," and they start poking around, and it just jogs so many memories or thoughts that they've had, and can lead to kind of like a wealth of, um, I don't know, just good feedback. Another good one that I always find is kind of, especially if your product has a handful of different features, just kind of floating like, "Oh, hey, I noticed you guys aren't using XYZ. Like, tell me about that. Was that a conscious decision, or you get a ton of I was confused about how this, that, or the other works, and it's like, oh, okay, and it just kind of shines a light on some of those things. So yeah, all great questions. Yeah, yeah, always leaning towards the more open-ended side for sure. Um, okay, talk to me about. Let's see what else. Another big part of it is around having having other folks on the product team join on calls. Teresa Torres, at least, is kind of pretty, I think, pretty adamant about even like dev and design joining. Um, from what I remember, you guys didn't start with a big emphasis on that. Talk me through that, and kind of what the pros and cons of that were, and yeah, just your experience in general there.
Yeah, and maybe I'll like sort of increase the scope of this question a little bit around like after reading Teresa's book, and sort of like looking through people's blog posts of like how they implemented it at their different organizations. Like one of the things that we were very cognizant of, and like bringing this back to what I initially shared around the MVP and the idea that like we thought this was not right for us, was that like
Hmm.
we really pick and chose what was recommended for the stage of our company, for sort of where we were at within the product team. And so the two specific things that I'll call out that we didn't do was definitely um this concept of the like the pod, or like the triad. Like we didn't
Yeah.
involve design and engineering. And then the second thing is we didn't really implement the opportunity solution trees. And so with both of those things, it was really just a matter of like, did we think it was effective at sort of the stage that we were at? And so on the first point
Mhm.
around this triad, the difficulty there was because it's continuous and we're a fast moving startup, it was already difficult enough for us to think about it from a product perspective of having these calls appear on your calendar to talk to people.
Mhm.
It was extra difficult for like the rest of the organization, and that would have been a higher barrier to entry for us to sort of get buy-in. And so it was like, why do that so early on? um,
Mhm.
One specific thing I'll highlight is that like at our stage of the organization, we only had one designer. And that designer was focused not just on product design, but also on marketing design. So this person was very time poor. And on
Mhm.
the engineering side, um, one piece of it is like at this level of maturity or like early stage side of the organization is what is the best sort of use of an engineer's time. And we didn't feel like this was it. Um,
Mhm.
But I would highlight that we got a lot of engineering involvement in the more specific user and customer research calls. So when there was a
Yeah.
specific topic, we would loop them in, both
Mhm.
engineering and design. So that was
Yeah.
like the reason why we didn't do that with the triads. Um, in terms of the opportunity solution tree, so we did actually test it out. It just was a lot. It was a lot of um, kind of like manual effort to like plot things down. It took a long
Mhm.
time to sort of like sit there and go through everything. And
Mhm.
so again, it was just something to do with the complexity behind that. That we knew eventually we would have to get there. And I think like once you have it available and you're constantly updating it and you've built the muscle to do that, it would be, I can see how helpful it is. But at our stage, it was much easier just to have a shared Google Doc, throw everything in, don't make it overly complicated. We would have weekly check-ins amongst the product team to talk about like everything that we'd learned. I think out of these conversations, it was helpful to for each of the PMs to actually surface any gaps in their own product knowledge, or any um, interesting insights around like maybe they hadn't kept in touch or like kept abreast of some of the updates that the other team had shipped on.
Mhm.
They didn't have some of the additional context, and like, so I think at this stage for us, this was really helpful in us understanding where the gaps were within the org or within the product org that helped us fill. And then the second thing was, it was really great for thoughtful discussions amongst the team of like, hey, like, someone came to us about this particular problem. It's fall squarely within my product area. But when you bring it up within the team, you realize, hey, actually, like, well, how about like, actually, we already have something that could potentially be either a workaround if it's not a priority, or actually like
Mhm.
we're actually working on something that's like could possibly tackle this, or we could like expand the scope of like what we're doing here to address that if it's critical enough. So
Yeah.
ultimately, I think the sort of taking all of that insight into one place, it just was about a discussion and a conversation to make that valuable to the team.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I asked that just because I kind of wanted to like normalize. I feel like sometimes when people talk about things like this, they get a little almost, I don't know what the word is, like religious about it. Like there's one
Mhm.
right way to do it. And if you're not doing it this way, you're not doing it at all. And it's like, well, for a young org in the interest of like crawl, walk, run, like we're doing what works for us. And like, sure, we see the benefits of maybe doing it that way, obviously, you know, pulling more people into it, but like this is what makes sense for us at this size. And biting it, like if you try and bite off more than you can chew on the first go around, like you're just gonna kind of spit the whole thing out and be back at square one. So um okay, I did want to talk. Yeah, I did want to get a little bit more into. You'd said didn't really use, didn't really do OSTs as much. Want to talk just, I don't know, just more about the format that this feedback came into, how you guys organized it, what other things you did to disseminate this feedback, such that like the whole organization can benefit from the insights that are being generated by these calls.
Yeah, I would probably say that like we didn't do a fantastic job of that, but that wasn't limited to this initiative with continuous research. It was a more probably holistic challenge around any feedback that we were getting. So I think one thing that worked decently well for us, especially early on and continues to be, is just to have a like notes and user feedback channel within Slack where
Hmm.
anyone in the organization is dropping in sort of like tidbits of things. And so what we were doing was like we would synthesize and put things into that Slack channel. Reflecting on that, I don't think it's the most effective way of disseminating insights. It's really interesting because I was recently on a call with sort of a pre-seed stage startup who was trying to tackle that exact problem. And the reason why it's such a challenge is there's a lot of manual work to synthesize this information. There's a lot of manual work to like put it in a format that makes sense for everyone else to read. So for us at this stage, we were primarily doing a lot of stuff that would get the product team up to speed. I think the next phase of this was taking the most critical things that we felt like was worthwhile surfacing and then disseminating that. What we tried to do was actually present at an all hands. Um, and that was actually really well received. With the all hands in those situations, we were also able to not only like come together with like a broad synthesis, but also what I've found most effective, not just at Airbyte, but also in my past organizations, was to take sort of partial clippings of your conversation, whether that's through Gong or like whatever recording service you use, and to actually
Hmm.
play that during those sessions. But
Hmm.
ultimately, that was a lot of work for us. And so, like,
Hmm.
we didn't actually do a great job of making that consistent. And so that's where the Slack channel, as well as when it came to planning, we were able to come to the conversations more informed. And then only at that point did we sort of bring some of the backing that we had, but it wasn't broadcasted.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a tough, man. That's a tough one. I think it's something that everyone struggles with. It's just a lot. Not much to say other than it's just a lot of extra work to package that stuff up and get it in front of people on top of like doing the work, like doing the interviews yourself, and then just like doing your whole damn day job in addition to the rest of it. So feel you on that one.
I think
Um,
that's actually just very quickly to touch on this is I think that's where like AI comes into it. Like I think there are several companies these days thinking about, I mean, ultimately like what's the unsexiest part of someone's job, and I think this is one of those things is like the manual work around synthesizing and understanding insights and then making that translating that to something that's actionable. I think there's a lot of work that can be done there.
yes, totally. Yeah, even already the difference between, sales folks from our team would say like, "Hey, just had a great call with XYZ company. Here's a link to the recording." And it's like, "Oh man, I got to listen to a 45-minute talk." I'm sure it's full of gold. Um, but even just like being able to apply, I mean, a lot of things are already applying, like highlights from the call, like just it's already able to surface some of those. So excited to see where that goes in the future. I'm sure it's going to help a lot. Um, okay, last thing, and then can get into a couple questions that were kind of pre-submitted by the community. So let's fast forward a couple months after you guys start doing this. What's like different about the way that Airbyte was doing product? Like what do you guys feel like was kind of the net effect a few months in?
I think the most immediate and most obvious thing was we were having a lot more conversations amongst the product team across the different
Mhm,
sort of business areas. And so I like touched
mhm,
on this earlier. I think like it gave us the sort of talking points to have conversations to break down any barriers that existed or any silos that existed around like, oh, like what's happening in that part of the business? Oh, is this problem something that could bring us together so that we can collaborate as like multiple teams rather than just thinking about it as one? So that's probably the first and foremost. Um, and that was like very evident and clear from the get-go. I think the
mhm.
second one is around having greater confidence in talking to your stakeholders. I think one thing that happens a lot, especially at an early stage startup, is like whoever your leader is, in this case, it was like my CEO. Oftentimes the question is like, just out of the blue, it would just be like, what do users think about this? Or like, how painful is it to do X?
Mhm.
And like, unless you're like the end persona and you're constantly using the product, and you're constantly talking to customers or users, it's really difficult for you to answer that without kind of like, oh, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm not on Slack right now and I'm going to like go figure it out and then I'm going to come back and let this person know. And so the CEO is just one example of that, but I think like you come
Yeah.
into a lot of these conversations with the rest of go-to-market team, with other executive team members when you go into planning and people are kind of like, okay, like this is the strategy that we're going with for this quarter or for this cycle. Who else has something to add? There's as the product team had a lot more ammunition to offer. And I think one thing I shared with you before is like working with the sales org, typically at these points in time of like, what should we work on next? There tends to be a ton of recency bias. And I
Yeah.
think PMs should often be held accountable for pushing back on that recency bias. Obviously, with a lot of like data driven sort of conversations, but also I think it's important for PMs and in using this format to build a muscle around like holistically, how am I viewing things? What is the intuition that I'm building that something
Mhm,
is or isn't right? How do I push
mhm.
back on some of this recency bias? Like a salesperson might come to you and say, like, hey, like this is a huge pain point. But you've spent the past 6 months talking to users and like you haven't heard that come up. And so then you can come to that conversation much more informed. Um,
Yes.
I think the final thing I'll say, which is probably a bit more like indirect, but is a well-known fact, is a lot of folks I talk to, a lot of like early stage PMs actually ask the question of like, how do I develop better product sense? How do I develop better empathy? And this is a
Mhm.
great way of doing it, right? Like there's obviously ways where like you're going and using the product yourself, but like talking to users and that forcing function um really gets you up to speed and builds that inherently in you.
Yes, I love that. Yeah. Seeing again and again and again why something doesn't make sense to this person or something doesn't work for that person when it made sense to you or you understood it, then you're kind of forced to evaluate like, oh, okay, what are the things that led to this kind of mismatch of understanding? And yeah, it's 100%. It's a muscle that you kind of build over time just by doing that. So love that. One other thing I wanted to say, which is in the ballpark of something you were already saying, was around um, pushing back on I don't know, just instances of recency bias for, hey, what should go on the roadmap is, I think one of the part of the beauty of doing this is um you can like in theory, like you got 6 calls scheduled over the next 2 weeks. Like you can validate these things. Any question that comes up becomes then easy to validate because hey, we already got a couple calls scheduled. It doesn't feel like, oh, I have to kind of spin up this, it's like a Herculean effort if you're not already doing this. Any research project can feel a bit like a yeah, Herculean effort to spin up. But when you're already doing it like a little bit every week, getting any question then feels just so much easier. So love
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. I'd plus one that one thing I will highlight is I've had folks come to me and ask me like almost like how continuous discovery replaces customer and user research. And it doesn't, right? Like those are two separate things. I think that even if your company and your organization is doing user research and customer research well, that means you're digging deep and figuring out a particular topic area, and that's great. Doing continuous discovery doesn't mean you shouldn't do the dig deep user research, but to your
Mhm,
point, I think it gives you a greater sense of like generally what to focus on for your user research, but also
mhm,
like a high level understanding of, I mean, these conversations are not always long conversations. You're not going into them prepared. And so there's bound to be more insights that you need to grab. But the continuous discovery is really to give you a general pulse of like, what are the things that I do need to dig into? What are the investments that I want to, as a team, ideate on? And then once
mhm.
there, you've got a slew of information already that you take into the user research. And that helps you inform like, what are the hypotheses that I want to test out? What are the questions I want to dig deeper into? And it's only at that point that you sort of, yeah, drill deeper. But
Yeah.
both things
Okay.
are very important.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. A couple questions that folks from the community had submitted ahead of time. James Snook had asked, how many customers to talk to each week? For how long? Um, yeah, let's just start right there.
Cool. Um, so I think the question of how many customers is entirely up to your team's capacity,
Mhm,
and sort of how well you've sold it into the organization. For us, we didn't have a set number. We sort of just kept it uncapped.
mhm,
The idea was that we can always pull back on the number of calls that you get, but it's usually much more difficult to recruit enough people to actually have these conversations with you. So we sort of just had everything wide open, with the idea
mhm,
that if someone felt overwhelmed, we would make some incremental adjustments to either the round robin, scheduling, whatever it
mhm.
was, or maybe the channels that we did the outreach to.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Implementation question there. Did all the PMs just have like a 1 hour slot that was like hard blocked on their calendar because they know, oh, I might get a user interview scheduled there, or like how did you guys manage that? Managing a round robin in general.
So we
You
didn't,
don't know.
we weren't necessarily like stringent or formulaic about how we did it. I know that like, in looking at some of the PM calendars, I think like most people blocked probably about 3 to 4 hours at various times. I tended to just block like probably like one entire day. For me, like Fridays were my no meeting days, and so there was more likelihood that I would have free time there. But
Mhm.
um, again, that was something that was like fairly iterative. And I think like one thing that I do want to stress with some of these questions coming in is like exactly that, like what you said earlier, Steve, around like people think that there's a right and a wrong way to do it. People think that there's a formula to do it. And I think that that's never the case. For us, we were very open minded about how things would happen. We were just like, let's just get it out there. And if we need
Mhm.
to adjust, like we can adjust, right? Like your team's going to get really busy during planning season. So you
Yep.
reduce the number of hours available. That's, yeah.
Yes. Yes. Okay, and then the last one from the community was around, and you touched on this a little bit, but Liz Heinberg was asking for tips around sourcing the right customers for discovery. Um, did you guys think anything about like do I don't know, especially like surfacing this more for folks that you know are in your ICP or maybe of a certain Maybe they're on the business plan, so like we really want to talk to those people. Or did you think about segmenting who you were like really trying to get things scheduled with?
Again, the answer is no. I think we talked about it,
Mhm.
but I think this comes back down to what I said earlier around like you can always reduce the funnel. It's much more difficult to increase the funnel. Um,
Yeah.
for us at Airbyte, I think like we had two pretty clear and distinct groups of users. One was on our community side who were using our open source free um, sort of offering, and then we had folks who were on the paid cloud SaaS based offering. And so that was a very clear delineation that we could have made. Within the cloud SaaS based product, there's also a delineation between like, hey, are they like free users? Are they like within a certain ICP score? We didn't want to overcomplicate it. And I also honestly believe that there's very strong value. Like none of the cores that we ever took were considered wasted time. Even if they weren't the right person, there were tidbits of information that you were garnering that will always serve you later on, right? Like it could be that like that's not exactly the person that you're targeting right now, but the purpose of continuous discovery is not to have sort of like siloed pieces of information. The whole purpose is so that you have that holistic view. And so to me, anyone that is like interested in operating off the service and offering that you're providing, no matter who they are, will be able to give you insights that might not be useful right away, but it'll help you build an intuition around that particular target for a future state.
Cool. Okay, love that. Alrighty. Any last bits? Any questions I should have asked that I didn't? Anything else come to mind?
No, I feel like this was fairly exhaustive. You did a great job of asking a ton of these questions, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So yeah,
Yeah.
nothing else to add.
Cool. All right. Well, hey, just want to say thanks. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the crowd for coming. I know everyone's super busy, so always appreciate your time. Where can folks find you online to connect?
Yeah, so I'm pretty easy to search, I think, even on Google. So just my name on Google will probably show you all the different social profiles, but probably the best places are either LinkedIn or Twitter. On LinkedIn, I mean, just search my name. On Twitter, my handle is YEOA. And recently I started a Substack, so like look out for the continuous discovery post that's going to come out sometime next week. And any other writing that I do.
Cool. Dope. Alrighty. I think after that we can wrap. So thanks, and we'll see you all next time.
Amazing. Thanks, folks. Bye.
Cool. Yeah. See ya.